All right, folks, get ready for a deep dive. Today, we're going deep into baseball history.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah, you sent in some really interesting stuff, including some pieces from that Wikipedia article on the history of baseball.
History of baseball, right?
Right, so we're going to dig into all that. And I've got a couple burning questions. First, did baseball actually start in the U.S.?
Good question.
Yeah, and of course, we got to talk about Babe Ruth. How did he become such a legend? To guide us through all this, we've got a true baseball history expert with us, ready to dive in.
Absolutely. Let's play ball. You know, it's funny how many people think that Abner Doubleday invented baseball over there in Cooperstown.
Yeah.
It's a nice story, but it doesn't really hold up when you look into it.
Yeah, that Doubleday myth. I've heard that one a lot.
Hmm.
So if he didn't invent it, where did baseball come from?
Well, the real story goes back further, across the Atlantic to England. Back in the 1700s, they had games like rounders, stool ball, and tut ball.
Tut ball.
Yeah.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah. They were like early versions of baseball, like baseball's, quirky ancestors.
So baseball's more British than American. Now that's a curveball I wasn't expecting.
Exactly. And get this, the very first mention of baseball that we know of is actually in a British children's book
Oh, really?
from 1744. It's called A Little Pretty Pocket Book. There's even a picture in it of a game that looks a lot like early baseball, with the triangular field and posts instead of bases.
A children's book, huh? That's interesting. I can just imagine those kids running around in their old-timey clothes playing a game like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess it makes sense. Games with bats and balls have been around for a while.
For sure.
So how did this very British pastime end up in America?
Like a lot of cultural things, it traveled with immigrants. When English people started settling in North America, they brought their love of bat and ball games with them.
Makes sense.
And in the early 1800s, baseball started to take off, especially in New York City. That's where clubs started forming and things started to get a little more organized.
So New York was like the early hub of baseball. That's interesting.
It was, but here's a fun fact for you. The first official baseball game, with a scorecard and everything, actually took place in Canada in 1838.
Wait, Canada. So much for America's pastime starting in America.
Well, it's funny how these things work out. It seems like America maybe popularized baseball, but didn't actually invent it.
That's a pretty cool trivia fact.
Yeah.
Okay, so early games in Canada and the U.S., were they pretty much like the baseball we know today?
Well, they were similar, but with some interesting differences. For a while, they actually used 5 bases instead of 4.
5 bases, wow.
Yeah, can you imagine? But the game's popularity exploded in the U.S., especially around New York. By the mid-1850s, newspapers were already calling baseball the national pastime.
That's amazing. It seems like baseball was captivating America even before the Civil War. Do you think that rapid rise in popularity is what pushed people to create a more formal structure for the game?
Oh, absolutely. That surge in popularity led to the creation of the first governing body for the sport, the National Association of Baseball Players, in 1857.
The National Association of Baseball Players, okay.
It was a big step towards standardizing the rules and getting everyone on the same page.
Right. I guess when you have more people playing, you start getting different regional variations, so you need some consistency. And that's where the idea of a professional league comes in, right?
Exactly. And just a year later, in 1858, the Cincinnati Red Stockings became the first pro baseball team.
Wait a minute. Wasn't that the team that had a perfect season?
You got it. During the 1869 season, they played against a mix of semi-pro and amateur teams, and they didn't lose a single game.
That's incredible. No losses. Wow, that's setting the bar pretty high right from the start. Makes you wonder if that kind of dominance was common back then or if the Red Stockings were just that good. What do you think?
Well, you got to remember that the level of competition wasn't quite the same as what we see in Major League Baseball today.
Right.
The Red Stockings were pioneers, and their perfect season really helped solidify the idea of a professional league. Speaking of which, in 1871, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players was formed. Some historians debate whether it truly qualifies as a major league, but it was definitely a major step towards professionalizing the sport.
So, kind of like the early days of any industry, right? A bit chaotic, figuring things out as they go. Were there any weird rules in that early league compared to the baseball we're used to?
You bet. For a time, catching a fair ball on the first bounce actually made it an out. Can you imagine the outfielders these days?
Whoa, that's crazy.
Just scooping up grounders for easy outs.
Wow, the game has definitely changed a lot over time. Even something as basic as catching a ball was different.
And just 5 years later, in 1876, the National League was born. It's the oldest surviving major league, and it's still going strong today.
The senior circuit, as they call it. So we've got the game getting organized, professionalized, and then the National League emerges.
Hmm.
What happened next? Were there other leagues popping up trying to compete?
There were a few other leagues that came and went, but none of them really took off. But it's important to remember that this period also marked the beginning of a pretty dark chapter in baseball history, the color barrier.
Right, when black players were excluded from the major leagues. A terrible period for baseball and for the country.
Absolutely. While there were a couple of attempts at integration earlier on, like Moses Walker playing in the American Association in 1884, by the 1890s, black players were essentially banned from the white-owned major leagues. And that led to the formation of the Negro Leagues, where some of the most talented players in history ended up playing simply because of the color of their skin.
It's a reminder that even as the game was evolving, it was still dealing with some deeply rooted problems. A reminder that progress isn't always straightforward.
Yeah, for sure. But while the color barrier was a major issue, the actual rules of the game were mostly settled by the 1890s. And guess what? A big rivalry was brewing that would change the whole landscape of pro baseball, the rise of the American League.
The classic American League versus National League rivalry. Every baseball fan knows about that. Tell me more about how it all started.
Well, the American League actually grew out of the minor Western League and officially became a thing in 1901.
Okay.
And these two leagues, they were fierce rivals, constantly fighting over the best players, sometimes even ignoring each other's contracts. It was pretty wild.
Wow, a real power struggle.
Hmm.
I bet those early years of the rivalry were intense for everyone involved, both players and fans. So how did they eventually settle this battle for dominance?
After years of battling it out, they finally made peace in 1903 with the National Agreement.
Okay.
It brought peace between the leagues, created the National Baseball Commission to oversee everything, and, most importantly, led to the creation of the World Series.
A World Series, the big one, the ultimate showdown. So 1903 was a pretty important year for baseball.
It was, but there was a little hiccup in 1904 when the National League champion, the New York Giants, refused to play the American League champion. They basically said the American League wasn't a real major league.
Oh, so some bad blood still lingering there.
Exactly. But thankfully, the Giants came around in 1905, and the World Series became the annual championship we know and love today.
Thank goodness for that. I can't imagine baseball without the World Series. Speaking of drama, I'm dying to hear about the Black Sox scandal. It's one of those stories that just grabs your attention.
Oh yeah, the Black Sox scandal, definitely one for the history books. It all went down in 1919 when 8 members of the Chicago White Sox conspired to intentionally lose the World Series.
Intentionally lose. Wow.
Yeah, it was a mix of greed and frustration with their owner, Charles Comiskey. The guy was known for being really cheap.
So a classic tale of corruption and betrayal, right at the heart of America's favorite pastime. What a huge impact that must have had.
It was massive. The National Baseball Commission was disbanded, and they created the position of the Commissioner of Baseball to clean up the game and restore public trust. The first commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, came in and really laid down the law. And it's interesting, the first significant Negro League was also founded that same year.
Wow, so much change and upheaval happening all at once. It feels like baseball was going through a real period of transformation, both internally and in how it interacted with society.
It was. But despite all the challenges, the game kept evolving. And that brings us to the next chapter, the end of the dead ball era and the rise of a guy who would completely redefine the sport, Babe Ruth.
Ah, Babe Ruth, the Sultan of SWAT. Now things are about to get really interesting. I'm ready to hear about how he changed the game.
So before we get to the Babe, we got to understand just how different baseball was back in the early 1900s. It was a much slower game, lower scoring, and pitchers really ruled the day.
Yeah, it was almost like a completely different sport. We mentioned it earlier, the dead ball era.
Yeah.
Was it just that the pitchers were that much better back then?
Well, there were a bunch of things going on. First, the baseballs themselves were different. They weren't as standardized, so they were often heavier and didn't fly as far.
Oh, okay.
Plus, they got dirty and stuffed up really fast, making them even harder to hit.
Yeah, I could see how that would make for less exciting games. No home runs flying out of the park.
Exactly. And then you've got the pitching. Pitchers had all sorts of tricks back then, some of which are actually illegal now.
Oh, really? Like what?
The spitball, for instance. Pitchers would mess with the ball to make it move in crazy ways.
Wow, that's wild. Sounds like baseball was still in its early stages, figuring out what worked and what didn't. And then there was that awful tragedy, right?
Yeah, in 1920, a terrible thing happened that changed the course of the game. Ray Chapman, a shortstop for the Cleveland Indians, was hit in the head by a pitch and died the next day. It was a devastating loss and really forced everyone to rethink the rules and safety of the game.
That's heartbreaking. It's a reminder of just how dangerous baseball could be back then, especially with all those tricked-out baseballs. So how did that event impact the rules?
Well, the leagues knew they had to do something to make things safer. They started enforcing stricter rules about the condition of the balls and banned things like the spitball to give hitters a better chance.
That makes sense.
And this happened around the same time that there were big improvements in how baseballs were made.
Oh, interesting.
The new balls were made with better materials, tighter windings, and a cork center, which made them livelier and able to travel a lot farther.
So it's like everything came together at the right time. Safer rules, better technology, and fans probably wanting to see more action, more offense. Sounds like the perfect setup for a power hitter to come along and shake things up. Cue Babe Ruth, right?
Exactly. Babe Ruth, with his incredible natural power, was a phenomenal hitter. He joined the New York Yankees in 1920 and completely revolutionized the game. He shifted the whole focus away from that small ball style and those slow pitcher duels. Home runs, racking up runs, exciting the crowds.
And I think he also changed the whole image of the game, right?
Yeah.
I feel before Babe Ruth, baseball players weren't really seen as these big personalities, these superstars.
You're absolutely right. Babe Ruth was charismatic, flamboyant, and he loved the spotlight. He became a national icon. His larger-than-life personality drew huge crowds to the ballpark. He made baseball more exciting and, relatable for the average fan.
So we have rule changes, new technology, and a charismatic superstar, all converging to usher in a new era for baseball, one that celebrates the power hitter. It's amazing how all these different things can come together to create a huge shift in a sport.
And even as baseball kept growing in popularity, it was still grappling with the issue of segregation. The Negro Leagues were doing great, but black players were still shut out of the major leagues.
Right, which is a huge injustice considering all that incredible talent that was being excluded. We can't forget that part of baseball's history.
Absolutely, and it's a reminder that progress doesn't always happen in a straight line. But then, 1947, things really started to change.
Yeah, 1947.
Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, decided to take a chance and signed Jackie Robinson to play for their minor league team in Montreal.
Brave move.
And then, April 15th, 1947, Jackie Robinson made his major league debut with the Dodgers. He broke the color barrier, something that had stained the sport for so long.
It's a moment that resonates even today, not just in baseball, but in the entire history of our country. How big of an impact did Jackie Robinson have on the game and on society as a whole?
Huge. His courage, his perseverance in the face of such terrible racism, it paved the way for other black players to finally get their shot in the major leagues. Larry Doby followed soon after, joining the Cleveland Indians.
Right.
It was a slow and often painful process, but Jackie's breakthrough was a major victory for equality and a turning point for the game.
It's hard to imagine the pressure he must have felt, being the first to break that barrier. What happened to the Negro Leagues after Jackie Robinson and other black players started joining the major leagues?
Sadly, they began to decline.
I can see how that would happen.
As more and more talented black players moved to the major leagues, the Negro Leagues lost their star power. They eventually folded in 1960. It's a bittersweet ending to a chapter that showcased amazing talent, but also highlighted how unjust segregation was.
A reminder that even positive change can sometimes have unintended consequences. So while baseball was dealing with these major issues of race and equality,
Right.
what else was going on? How was the game itself changing?
Well, right around the time that Jackie Robinson was breaking the color barrier, baseball was also expanding geographically. Until 1958, there were no major league teams west of St. Louis.
Wow, really?
But that year, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants moved to the West Coast, becoming the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah.
It feels like that's when baseball really started to become a truly national sport, reaching new fans all over the country.
Exactly. And this westward expansion continued with the Los Angeles Angels joining the American League in 1961. And speaking of 1961, that was a big year for another reason. Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's single-season home run record.
Whoa, back-to-back years of major milestones. First the westward expansion, and then a new home run king. It's like baseball was entering this exciting new era.
It really was. And get this, 1961 was also the first time the Major League schedule was expanded from 154 to 162 games.
Oh, wow, that's a big change.
This longer season, along with other factors, probably helped Maris break the record, but it was still controversial. Some people argued that those extra games gave him an unfair advantage.
Interesting. So we've got westward expansion, a new home run record, a longer season, all within a few years. Feels like baseball was really trying to reinvent itself. What about the players? Were their roles changing as well?
They were. As baseball got bigger and more profitable, players started demanding more. A bigger piece of the pie, so to speak. The Major League Baseball Players Association, their union, started to gain some real power in negotiations.
So it's not just the game on the field that's evolving, but the whole power dynamic between players and owners. Sounds like a recipe for some serious conflict.
You got it. The next few decades would see some major labor battles, including the first general players' strike in 1972. But even with all that drama going on off the field, the game itself kept changing. Remember the designated hitter rule?
The DH. Introduced in the American League in 1973, right? It's been a hot topic ever since. Some purists saying it messed with the strategy of the game.
It definitely added a new wrinkle, and fans are still debating it to this day. But an even bigger change came in 1975. They got rid of the reserve clause, which opened the door for the free agency system we have today.
So for the first time, players could choose where they wanted to play. That must have been a huge deal for them.
It was. It was a big win for the players and their union. They finally had more control over their careers and how much money they could make.
It sounds like the balance of power was really shifting in favor of the players. It's amazing to see how much changed in just a few decades, from how the game is played to the relationships between players and owners.
It really shows how baseball is connected to what's happening in society, the economy, and culture at large. The game never stops changing, both on and off the field.
And just when you think you've seen it all, something new comes along. I'm excited to hear what happened next. What challenges and victories did baseball face in the later part of the 20th century? So we've gone from those early days in England all the way through baseball becoming America's pastime. Now we're heading into the late 20th century. It seems like baseball was at a real turning point. Players have more power, the game's expanding. What new challenges popped up?
Well, one of the biggest things that hit baseball was the steroid era. You had players like Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, all caught up in using performance-enhancing drugs.
Right.
It was a time when you saw all these offensive records being broken, home runs flying out of the park, but it really made people question the integrity of the game.
Yeah, I remember watching it all unfold. It was exciting, but there was always this cloud of suspicion hanging over everything.
Right.
How did baseball handle this?
At first, the response was pretty slow. There wasn't a real policy in place for dealing with performance-enhancing drugs until 2004 when MLB finally put in a system for testing and penalties.
Okay.
But as more people started speaking out against it, the league had to step up and take more action, to show fans that they were serious about fixing things.
It felt like baseball had to face some hard truths about itself. Fans had to question whether some of their heroes were playing fair. Do you think those efforts to clean up the game actually worked?
I think they were a good start. It took a while for people to trust the game again, but I think the league showing that they were serious about testing and punishments helped.
It's interesting how this controversy happened. At the same time, baseball was becoming more popular again. Attendance was booming in the late 90s and early 2000s. Do you think that was just a coincidence? Or were those home run chases, even with the steroid issue, part of what drew people back to the ballpark?
That's a tough question. It's probably a mix of things. But yeah, I think those home run races definitely played a part. There was so much excitement. People wanted to see history being made, even if they had some doubts in the back of their minds.
It shows how complicated our relationship with sports can be. We want to believe in the purity of the game, but we also love the spectacle, even if it might be a little tainted. But baseball is more than just home runs and scandals. What about how the game was expanding globally during this time?
We've talked about Canada, but baseball really is a global sport now. Take Japan, for instance. They have a long history with baseball. Their pro leagues are super competitive, and the fans there are incredibly passionate.
That's cool. It's amazing to see how baseball has taken root in different parts of the world and evolved in its own unique way. What about Latin America?
Latin America is like a talent factory for baseball. You've got
Right.
countries like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela. They've produced some of the biggest names in the game. Baseball is a huge part of the culture in many Latin American countries, and they've had a massive influence on MLB.
It really highlights how baseball has gone from being America's pastime to a truly global sport.
Are there any international tournaments or events that showcase all this global talent?
Absolutely. The World Baseball Classic is a perfect example. It brings together all the best national teams from around the world. It's a really fun tournament that shows just how widespread the love of baseball is.
It's incredible to think about how far the game has come. We started this whole deep dive talking about how baseball wasn't even invented in America, and now we're seeing it played all over the world. Right. And it doesn't stop there. Baseball is still evolving, with new rules being added all the time, like the pitch clock, limits on defensive shifts, all designed to speed up the game and make it more exciting.
It shows that baseball isn't afraid to change and adapt to try to appeal to new fans and keep the game fresh. And we're also seeing the rise of women's baseball, with Women's Baseball World Cup becoming more and more popular. It's really exciting to see.
Absolutely. The future of baseball is looking pretty bright.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the early days in England to baseball's global reach today. It's clear that baseball is more than just a game. It's a reflection of our culture, our history, our values. It's something that brings people together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Baseball will always have a special place in our hearts. I have a feeling it'll be around for a long time to come.
This deep dive has been a real home run. And to all of you listening, we hope you've enjoyed this journey through baseball history as much as we have. Now it's your turn. Go explore, learn more, and see what fascinating discoveries you can make about this amazing game.